She burned it at dusk, not in anger, not with ceremony. She simply held the paper over the small tin bowl she kept on the porch step, struck a match against the stone railing, and touched the flame to the corner. The paper caught slowly the way old things do, reluctant, then all at once. Wren Calloway stood barefoot on the packed earth outside a log cabin in the Wyoming high country and watched the last of it turn to ash. The evening light was the color of weak bourbon. The hills in the distance held their shape against a sky going purple at the edges. She did not look away until the bowl held nothing but gray. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and even, the voice of a woman who had learned to say difficult things without decoration. I came to Wyoming with a name that wasn't mine. I left with the one that was. The distance between those two things, that is what I'm going to tell you. 3 months before that evening, Wren Calloway sat in a lawyer's office in Hartford, Connecticut, wearing her good dress and her father's composure, and listened to a man with soft hands explain that she owned nothing. The desk between them was mahogany. The lawyer's name was printed in gold leaf on the door. His voice carried the particular gentleness of a man delivering bad news he would not have to live with. Her father's debts were substantial. The house would be seized within the month. The schoolhouse where she had taught reading and arithmetic to the children of the parish would close by September. There was a small account, enough for perhaps 6 weeks of modest living if she was careful, and then nothing after that. The lawyer slid a document across the desk. She read it. Every line. He watched her with the mild surprise of a man unaccustomed to women who read documents rather than expressions. When she finished, she folded it with the crease exactly along the original fold, placed it back on his side of the desk, and stood. She walked home through streets she had walked since childhood, past the elm that marked the corner of Birch and Fourth, past the dry goods store where her father had run a tab he never mentioned, past the church where she had sat in the front pew for 26 years and learned that suffering properly arranged could be called grace. She did not cry. There was no one to cry to, and the grief felt too old for tears. The kind of grief that has been building slowly beneath the surface of ordinary days. And when it finally arrives, it arrives as exhaustion rather than anguish. She went home. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened the drawer where her father kept his papers. The advertisement had been folded, twice the crease, soft with age. Someone had held it many times. Wyoming Territory seeks educated women of good character. Transportation provided. Position guaranteed. She did not know why her father had kept it. She told herself it did not matter why. She wrote her reply that night by lamplight in the careful hand she had spent years teaching to others. The train took 3 days. The stagecoach took another 2. A man with a flat expression and fewer words than his horse left her at the head of a dirt road and pointed. Wren stood at the edge of what the advertisement had called opportunity and looked at 12 miles of high Wyoming country between herself and a stranger's house. The air smelled of sage and something older underneath it. The mineral smell of earth that has never been asked permission. She had 1 bag. She picked it up and walked. The 2 women she had traveled with from the train station were assigned elsewhere. Agnes, 40 and practical as arithmetic, sent south toward a cattle outfit near the river. Louisa, 22 and still in possession of an uncomplicated heart, dispatched to a homestead. She was already calling charming before she saw it. Wren did not know what had been arranged for her. She knew only the name on the paper she carried: Sea Breaker, North Pasture Road, Harrow Creek. She found the name on a gate. The gate was well made, the kind of work that takes patience. The joints fitted close, no gap for wind to work its fingers into and widen over years. She noted this without deciding what it meant. The man was fixing fence. He did not stop when she came through the gate. He was perhaps 10 years her elder, dark-haired broad across the shoulders in the way of men who have done physical labor long enough that it has become structural. He moved with an economy that suggested he had learned not to waste effort, not from laziness, but from a long education in how much a body costs. He glanced at her once, then went back to the post he was setting. Kitchen's inside, wells around back. Room on the left door locks, and I don't have the key. That was all. Wren stood in the yard for a moment. She looked at the cabin's small, well-built chink tight against Wyoming winters. No curtains on the windows, no flowers at the door, no paint, no softening of any kind, but solid. The kind of structure that does not ask to be admired. She went inside. The books were unexpected. They lined a shelf along the far wall, 30, perhaps 40 volumes arranged in no order she could immediately read. History beside a farrier's manual. A surveyor's guide next to something in Latin. She did not touch them. She noted them the way she noted the locked door and the absence of photographs, as information about a man she had not been asked to understand, only to live alongside. She found flour, salt, pork, dried beans. She built a fire in the iron stove and cooked what she could from what was there. They ate at opposite ends of a table meant for more people. The man, Colt Breaker, she had read the name, had not yet heard it said, ate without comment. Finished everything on his plate. Did not look at her more than necessary. She cleared the dishes. She went to her room. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the particular silence of a place that has never held her voice before. The door had a lock. She had turned the key from the inside before she lay down. She did not know if that was caution or courtesy or some confused mixture of both. She thought about the way he had said it, door locks and I don't have the key, not as reassurance, not as apology, as fact. The way a man states a fact, he considers relevant and leaves the interpretation to the listener. She fell asleep thinking about what it meant that he had made sure she knew. 7 days passed in the grammar of work. Wren learned the rhythms of the place the way you learn a language you were not raised in, by listening more than speaking, by making errors quietly and correcting them before they require comment. She woke before him. She had breakfast on the table when he came in from his first check of the stock. He ate. She ate. They did not discuss the day ahead. He went out. She did what needed doing inside, then went out herself. She began teaching the children from the neighboring homesteads in the afternoons, not because anyone asked, but because she needed her hands occupied and her mind moving, and because the youngest Haggerty girl had been trying to sound out words in a seed catalog and getting them wrong in a way that would matter eventually. She sat up in the shade of the big juniper at the edge of the east pasture. 4 children, then 6, then 8. She brought whatever books she could spare from her bag. She taught without fanfare, without a schoolroom, without the institutional gravity of Hartford. The children came because their parents were curious or indifferent, and stayed because she made letters feel like tools rather than ornaments. Colt saw this on the 3rd afternoon. He was coming back from the upper pasture on horseback, and he slowed the animal when he saw the small congregation under the juniper tree. Wren was kneeling in the dirt beside the youngest Haggerty girl, her finger tracing a word in the dust. He watched for a moment, then rode on. She noticed. He did not know that she did. On the 9th day, a man came from town. He wore a good coat and carried himself with the deliberate ease of someone who has grown accustomed to being received. He spoke with Colt in the yard just beyond the range of clear hearing. Wren stood at the kitchen window and watched without pretending she wasn't watching. She could read enough from posture. Colt stood straight through the entire conversation, did not offer his hand, did not invite the man onto the porch, did not shift his weight or look away. The other man did most of the speaking. At one point, he took out a small notebook and wrote something down. When he left, Colt came inside. He did not sit. He poured water from the pitcher and drank it standing at the counter. That was one of Reed's men, he said. The judge, Silas Reed. Yes. She waited. He wanted to know if the arrangement was satisfactory. He set the cup down. Those were his words. She had known this moment was coming. She had known from the first time she read the contract in the judge's office, the contract she had been handed in a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and institutional confidence. The contract she had signed because 6 months of room and board was better than 6 weeks of savings. And then the street. She had known because she had read every line, including the small ones at the bottom of page 3. I read the contract, she said. All of it. He turned to look at her. There's a clause, she said. Reassignment. If the arrangement is deemed unsatisfactory in the first 30 days. I know. It doesn't define what reassignment means. I know that too. The kitchen held the particular silence of a conversation that has just become real. Why did you tell his man it was satisfactory? She asked. Colt was quiet for a moment. Then, because the alternative was worse for you, she looked at him. He was not a man given to unnecessary words. This one landed with the weight of something he had considered before saying. She nodded once. She went back to the pot on the stove. On the 12th day, she found it. She wasn't looking for anything. Colt had asked her to locate the property deed he needed to check the survey marks against a document that had come from Reed's office, and she was searching the lower drawer of the cabinet where he kept papers. The deed was there where he'd said it would be. Below it, a small wooden box, the kind made to hold letters or keepsakes. She did not open it, but she saw the name carved into the lid in letters that had taken care. E. Breaker. She replaced the deed exactly as she had found it. She went back to the table and set the deed down, and said nothing about the box for the rest of the day. At supper that evening, she asked as plainly as she could, "Who is E. Breaker?" He went still. Not startled, there was no flinch, no sudden tensing. Just a stillness, as if the question had reached some interior part of him that didn't move quickly. "My sister," he said. "Eleanor. She died in '82. He offered nothing else. His voice was the voice of a man who has said a thing so many times in the private repetition of his own memory that he has worn the emotion smooth off it or tried to. She did not press him. She understood this kind of quiet. She had spent her adult life around a man who called his silences faith, but she sat with what she now knew. Colt Breaker was not cold. He was careful. He was a man who had suffered something specific and had decided the only dignified response was containment. That was not the same as hardness. It was not the same as absence. It was, she thought, the loneliest kind of discipline, the kind that asks nothing of anyone else, because it has already decided no one else can help. She thought about the locked door. She thought about it differently now. The boy appeared on a Tuesday. Wren saw him from the porch, thin, clean-looking in the way of town children, rather than ranch children perched on the top rail of the far fence, like a crow considering whether the ground below was worth investigating. When she raised her hand, he disappeared. He was back the next morning, closer. She did not invite him. She sat on the porch steps with a book open in her lap and read with the unhurried focus of someone who had nowhere pressing to be. After 20 minutes, she heard boots on gravel. He stopped at the edge of the yard, 13 perhaps, with the particular eyes of children who have learned to read rooms rather than people, a skill that gets developed under specific conditions. He did not say hello. He said, "Do you teach?" "I do. Numbers and letters, both. Would you teach me?" She closed the book with her finger holding the page. "Does your father know you're here?" Something shifted in his face, not quite a flinch, not quite resignation. Something practiced. "My father doesn't keep track of where I am when he's occupied." It was not said with bitterness. It was said the way a child states a fact he has long since made peace with, which is its own kind of heartbreak. "What's your name?" "Tommy Reed." She had not expected that name. Reed's son coming to sit in her yard and ask to be taught. She kept her face neutral. She moved over on the step. "Sit down, Tommy," she said. "We'll start with what you already know." Colt saw the boy that afternoon when he came in for water. He stood at the kitchen window for a moment. She could feel his attention from across the room, the quality of stillness that meant he was processing something. He would know whose son that was. There was not much that happened in this county that he did not know. He poured his water. He went back out. She taught Tommy Reed for 2 hours that first afternoon and discovered he was hungry in the way that has nothing to do with food absorbing everything she offered with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting a long time for someone to hand him exactly this. He was quick. He was precise. He corrected his own errors before she could. When he left, she watched him walk back down the road toward town. She thought about what kind of man raises a boy like that, intelligent, careful, already expert at making himself small, and then forgets to look at him. She thought she was beginning to understand Silas Reed in a way that was more useful than contempt. The judge came on the 28th day, 2 days before the end of the first month. Wren was inside when she heard one horse moving at the measured pace of a man who is not in a hurry because he does not need to be. She stayed at the kitchen table. She listened. Silas Reed's voice was the voice of a man who had spent decades in rooms where other people stood when he entered. Smooth, unhurried, accustomed to the weight of its own authority. She caught fragments through the window she had left cracked for the afternoon heat. Fine piece of country, this. Then something she could not hear. Then long as you're satisfied with the arrangement. Then Colt's voice, too low to parse. Then Reed again, something about the north pasture. Something about spring survey. Something about what a man in his position could do to simplify certain things if there was cooperation. She heard the word cooperation clearly. When Reed left and Colt came inside, she put a cup of coffee on the table before he said anything. She sat down across from him and waited. He looked at the cup for a moment. Then he said, "He wants the north pasture." I thought so. He has a way of getting what he wants. Through the courts, mostly. He has enough influence in this county that the difference between legal and his preference is mostly procedural. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. What does that have to do with me? He looked at her directly in a way he had not yet done with any consistency. His eyes were dark and unhurried, and they held more in them than his voice usually let out. Wyoming law, the new statutes, the ones that came in when they were drafting for statehood. A wife has independent legal standing. She can sign property documents as a co-holder. She can also contest them, which means a wife can also block a transaction a husband might otherwise be pressured into. Yes, and a husband with no wife signs a loan. And Reed has enough reach that a man signing a loan in this county signs what Reed wants him to sign eventually, one way or another. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, one of the horses moved in the near pasture. "So I am a legal instrument," she said. He held her gaze. Or a shield. It depends how you look at it. Those are different things. Yes. Which one did you intend when you agreed to the arrangement? He was silent for a long moment. The kind of silence that is not evasion, but genuine consideration. A man deciding whether to say the true thing or the comfortable thing and arriving at the true thing slowly. Because it costs more. "I intended to keep my land," he said. "I did not intend to deceive you about why." She looked at him for a long time. She was trying to locate dishonesty and finding something else instead. A man who had made a calculation and was for the first time uncomfortable with it, now that it was spoken aloud to the person who bore its weight. She stood. She went to the window and looked at the road Reed's horse had just left. "If I sign a marriage document," she said slowly, "I sign as myself, not as your legal strategy. If you need me to sign anything, you ask me. If I agree with the reason I sign. If I don't, I don't. That is the condition." She turned back to him. "Take it or don't." He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he said, "All right." She nodded. She went back to the stove. She did not let him see that her hands were unsteady as she picked up the ladle, not from fear, from the particular feeling of a woman who has just negotiated her own terms in a room where no one expected her to have any, which is to say, a feeling somewhere between exhilaration and exhaustion arriving at the same moment. The night was clear and reckless with stars. Wren had come out for air after supper, intending to stay a few minutes, and finding herself still sitting on the porch step an hour later. The high country dark was different from Connecticut. Dark, wider, less domestic. A dark that did not apologize for its depth. She was still learning to sit in it without filling it. Colt came out and sat on the step below her forearms, resting on his knees, looking up at the same sky. He was quiet for a while. Then he began to speak, and she realized he was naming stars, Not the Latin names from almanacs, but other names, older ones, names she did not recognize. That one, he said, pointing, they call the dog that runs ahead. And that cluster there, that's where the elk went in the deep winter, the old story says. That bright one is the woman who wouldn't come back down. His voice was different when he talked about this. Slower, less guarded, as if these were words he had spoken before to someone else in another part of his life, and they still carried the ease of that other time. She did not ask where he had learned it. She listened the way she listened to the children, when they read aloud, not for errors, for the shape of what they understood. They sat like that for a long while, the names of stars moving through the dark between them. Before she went in, she stopped with her hand on the door. "Colt," she said. She did not turn around. "If we sign a marriage document when we do, I will not sign as your legal advantage. I will sign as Wren Calloway, who became Wren Breaker, because she chose to, and for reasons that are her own." She heard him shift on the step behind her. "And if that's a different thing than what you were counting on," he asked. "Then it's a different thing," she said. "And you should decide now whether that matters." She went inside before he answered. She lay in the dark with the locked door between them, and the sound of Wyoming settling into night outside the window. The distant movement of cattle, the thin, cold wind off the high ground, the occasional call of something she still did not have a name for. And she thought about a man who named stars, in a language he'd been given by someone she knew nothing about. A man who had built a gate with joints so close the wind couldn't find them. A man who had told her on the first day that a door was locked, not as a warning, but as a fact he thought she deserved to have. She did not know what she was building here. She knew only that she was no longer pretending she wasn't building something. And that, she thought, was a beginning. Not a comfortable one, not an uncomplicated one, but the kind that was hers. Outside under the stars, Colt had named for her. The Wyoming dark did its long work. Patient wide, indifferent to the small human warmth of one lamp burning past midnight in a log cabin on a road with no one else on it. She blew out the lamp. She slept. The marriage document was signed on a Wednesday in the back room of the Harrow Creek Land Office, with Della Birch as witness and a court clerk named Aldous Price, who had the expression of a man who had seen enough of human arrangements to be surprised by none of them. There was no ceremony, no flowers, no spoken vows, no gathering of anyone who might later claim to have been present for something significant. Colt signed first, his handwriting plain and deliberate, the signature of a man who does not embellish. Wren signed beneath it. Wren Breaker, the new name sitting on the paper with a completeness that felt both strange and entirely her own. Aldous Price stamped the document and filed it without comment. Della Birch, 60 years of watching the world transact its business without consulting the women involved, poured 3 small glasses of something amber from a bottle she kept in her coat pocket. "To whatever this turns out to be," she said. They drank. On the ride back to the cabin, the paper folded in Wren's inside pocket. She did not speak, and Colt did not speak, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was simply the silence of 2 people who have just done something irreversible and are allowing themselves a moment to understand it before they are required to live inside it. She had folded the paper exactly along its original crease. She could feel it against her ribs as the horse moved beneath her. Wren Breaker. She turned the name in her mind the way you turn a stone to see what is underneath it. Not familiar yet. Not foreign either. Something in between, a thing that would either become her own over time or remain borrowed indefinitely. She intended it to become her own. She had learned early that intention was what separated the things you built from the things that happened to you. Della Birch's way station sat at the junction of two roads that had no official names on any county map, which suited Della fine. She had built it herself, the original structure. A single room expanded twice over 20 years, until it was a low, sprawling building that smelled of wood smoke dry goods and the accumulated residue of thousands of conversations that had taken place at its counter. She stocked flour, coffee, salt, lamp oil, ammunition, and information, and she was equally unsentimental about the pricing of all of them. Wren began coming weekly on Thursdays for supplies. The first 2 visits were transactional. On the third, Della looked at her for a long moment while measuring out coffee beans, then said, without preamble, "You read the contract, the whole thing." It was not a question. "Yes," Wren said. "Most of them don't. They see the part about transportation and guaranteed position, and they stop reading because they want to stop reading." Della poured the beans into a sack and rolled the top closed. The ones who read the whole thing are different. Different how harder to manage. She said it without inflection, as if it were simply a quality like height or coloring. Wren set her money on the counter. "How many women have come through this arrangement?" Della looked at her. A long, calibrating look. The look of a woman deciding whether the person in front of her has earned the next sentence. "Reed has been running this system for 3 years," she said finally. "Not to find wives for lonely men. To place women in specific properties." Wren kept her face still. "The contract gives him standing." Della continued. "As legal representative of the arrangement. If a husband finds himself unable to execute his legal obligations, and Reed has ways of creating that inability, Reed steps in. As representative, which means as signatory. He's done this before, twice. One man was charged with a property dispute that turned out to be fabricated, spent 6 months fighting it in the Cheyenne courts while Reed, as his legal representative, managed his affairs back here. By the time the charges were dropped, the North pasture had been sold. Legitimately. On paper. And the second man, Della was quiet for a moment. She set her hands flat on the counter. The second one had a wife. A real one, not from the arrangement. She got sick. He spent one bad winter without any support from the county debts piling up, no labor cattle dying from exposure. Reed offered to help. Small loans, small favors, the kind that compound. She looked at the window. By spring, the man had signed over the east section and convinced himself he'd chosen to. Wren thought about Colt's books, about the property deed she had handled, and the box beneath it. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Della picked up a cloth and wiped the counter with the focused attention of someone who does not want to look at the thing they are saying. 3 years ago, there was a woman in this arrangement who I didn't tell. Younger than you. Softer." She folded the cloth and set it down. "She lost her husband's land to Reed within a year. Didn't understand how it had happened. Didn't have the language for it." She looked up. "I had the language. I kept it to myself because I didn't think she could use it. I was wrong. I've been wrong about that every day since. Wren stood with that for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and took out a small notebook. "Tell me everything else you know," she said. The days found their shape. Colt was not a man who warmed quickly, but he was a man who was consistent. And Wren had lived long enough to know that consistency was the rarer quality. He was there when he said he would be there. He did what he said he would do. When something went wrong, a fence line cut by something or someone, a water barrel staved in overnight, he addressed it without drama and without blame. She learned to read the land through him, though he would not have called it teaching. He corrected errors. He pointed out things she had missed. He said things like, "Feel how the wind shifted. That's the storm coming around the south ridge, not the north means it'll break by morning," and then walked away, leaving her to decide whether she'd file that under useful or under strange. She filed all of it under useful. One afternoon she was stringing wire along the east fence. Her third attempt, the previous two having produced results that would have contained nothing more determined than a calm sheep. When he came by, and without comment repositioned her hands on the tool. "Don't pull straight. Angle into the post. The wire will seat itself." She angled. The wire seated. She did not thank him because he had already moved on, but she repeated the motion twice more to be sure she had it. And from that afternoon the fencing went faster. She noticed that he looked at her hands sometimes when she worked, not in any way that required comment, but with the attention of a man who has a specific respect for competent hands and is observing whether hers are becoming that. She could not have said when she began to want them to be. Tommy Reed came every afternoon that the weather allowed. He was learning to read above his age and doing arithmetic that most adults in the county could not have managed. And he was doing both with the suppressed intensity of a child who has been made to feel that wanting things is dangerous, and is found in this hour by the juniper tree, something that cannot be taken away while he is still in possession of it. One afternoon he arrived later than usual. His lower lip was swollen in the way that happens when a person has been struck or has fallen, and the particular angle of his shoulders told Wren which of those it had been. She did not ask. She set the book down on the step. "Today we learn geography," she said. "Tell me about a place you'd like to go." He sat. He thought about it with a seriousness that was not performed. "Anywhere that isn't Harrow Creek," he said. "Good. That's a beginning." They spent the afternoon talking about rivers, about the Missouri and where it went, and what was on either side of it, and what a person might find if they followed it long enough in either direction. Tommy asked questions that assumed a world larger than the one he had been permitted to inhabit, and she answered all of them as fully as she could. And at some point she looked at him and thought, this is what hunger actually looks like, when it isn't about food. Before he left, he asked her something that he had clearly been holding for a while. "Are you actually married to Breaker or just on paper?" She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze direct, curious, not impudent. The question of a boy who has been raised to read documents. That, she said, is a more intelligent question than your age requires. He almost smiled. "My father taught me to read contracts before books. He said contracts matter more." "Your father isn't wrong, but books teach you why a contract can be wrong." He considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then he walked back down the road toward town, and she watched him go. and she thought about what Della had told her about Silas Reed, and thought that a man who taught his son to read power before he taught him to read anything else was a man who had long since confused the two. Reed came back on a Thursday 3 weeks after the marriage was registered. Wren was at the way station when it happened, and she heard about it from Colt that evening, told plainly without editorial, the way he told everything. Reed had arrived while she was gone. He had spoken with Colt in the yard for perhaps 20 minutes. He had been, as always, perfectly courteous. He had brought a bottle of good rye whiskey, which Colt had not accepted. He had asked in the careful language of a man who never asks directly whether Colt might be willing to reconsider the North Pasture Survey, given that the county was in the process of formalizing its boundaries and certain adjustments might be mutually beneficial. Colt had said he was not interested in adjustments. Reed had smiled the smile of a man who is not discouraged because he has other tools. He had commented pleasantly that he had heard Wren was proving herself useful in the arrangement, that it was gratifying to see the system working as intended. "What did you say to that?" Wren asked. Colt looked at the table for a moment. "I said she was my wife, not the arrangement." Something moved through her at that, not sentiment exactly, not yet. Something more like the quiet arrival of a fact she had not expected to be true. She did not say anything. She passed the biscuits. 10 days after that, Della came to the cabin. She did not send word ahead. She arrived in the late afternoon with a burlap sack over one shoulder, and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is executing it before she can reconsider. She dropped the sack on the table. Inside, a battered copy of the Wyoming Territory Statutes of 1887, 2 ledgers, their covers worn, and a bundle of correspondence tied with cord. "Reed leaned on me," Della said. She stood by the table with her hands in her coat pockets. "Told me to stop giving you access to records and materials. Said he'd call a debt I owe him." Wren looked at the materials on the table, then at Della. And I spent a day thinking about it." Della's voice was flat and entirely certain. "I built that way station with my hands and my husband's money, and he's been dead 11 years, and the only person who has a claim on anything I own is me." She pulled up a chair and sat down. "He can call the debt. He'll get a bill of sale for a rocking chair and a spare axle. That's what I have in his name. You told him that I will once I've had supper." Wren sat down across from her. She put her hand on the ledgers. "What's in these 3 years of Reed's land transactions? Every one of them that touched my counter, my records, or the men who told me things while I was selling them coffee." Della folded her hands on the table. "I kept them because I am a woman who has watched men build systems for taking things that belong to other people, and I have learned that documentation is the only language they can't argue with." Wren opened the first ledger. She read. Colt was in the doorway by the time she was on the 3rd page. He had come in from the evening check without her hearing him. He stood with his hat in his hand looking at the table. "Della," he said. Acknowledgement. Something else underneath it. The particular note of a man who has not had many allies in a long time and is recognizing one. "Don't thank me," Della said. "I'm not doing it for gratitude. I'm doing it because I should have done it 2 years ago." She reached into the interior of her coat and drew out a folded letter separate from the bundle. She set it on the table in front of Wren and placed her hand flat on top of it. "There's one more thing," Della said. A clerk who used to work at the county office sold me his files when he left 3 years ago when he decided Reed's employment was not worth what Reed was paying for it. This was in the bundle. She paused. It came from Hartford. The handwriting on the outside is not Reed's. Wren looked at Della's hand covering the letter. She looked at the return address that showed at one edge Hartford, Connecticut, the handwriting familiar in a way that moved through her like cold water. "This is yours to look at or not look at," Della said. "When you're ready. Not before." Wren put her own hand over the letter and slid it to the side beneath the corner of the statute book. After she said, Della nodded. Nobody said anything else about it. That night they worked until long past midnight. Wren reading marking pages, translating the ledger's entries into a language that could be used in a courtroom. Colt sitting across from her, holding in his memory every piece of land in the county, every boundary and survey marker and handshake agreement that had or hadn't been formalized. What she could not find in the books, she could find in him. What she found in him, she wrote down in language the books would recognize. It was slow work. It was the kind of work that doesn't announce itself as important while you're doing it. Just a lamp burning, a pen moving, two people at a table in Wyoming long after the reasonable hour for sleeping. At some point, Wren's writing slowed. She was still looking at the page, but not seeing it. The words blurring slightly at the edges, the particular fatigue that comes not from the body, but from the sustained effort of holding too many things in careful order for too long. She became aware that Colt had set down what he was reading. She looked up. He pulled the statute book toward him, found the page she had dog-eared earlier in the evening, and began to read it aloud. He was not a man who read formally. His voice moved through the legal language the way a large, careful animal moves through underbrush, deliberate, making room, occasionally catching on something unfamiliar and working through it. He stumbled on encumbrance. He stopped and sounded it again. Continued. Wren watched him read. She did not say anything. She picked up her pen and kept writing, and he kept reading, and the lamp burned, and outside Wyoming did what Wyoming does at night, went enormous and cold and entirely indifferent, which from the inside of a lit cabin feels less like indifference and more like a kind of privacy the world doesn't often offer. The rain came on a Friday, not a storm, no warning, no drama. Just a low sky that had been considering it since morning, and by afternoon the consideration became a steady, unhurried downpour that turned the road to red mud and settled into the roof with a sound like a room full of people all doing something quiet at once. Tommy had come for his lesson before the rain started and stayed because the road back to town had become unreasonable by the time the lesson was done. He sat at the kitchen table with his geography book open, reading a passage about the Missouri River drainage that Wren had assigned, moving his lips slightly on the harder words. Colt was at the other end of the table with a length of bridle leather and a needle. The bridle had been giving him trouble for 2 weeks, a section of stitching that kept working loose, and he had finally decided to redo it properly, rather than keep mending the mend. Wren sat between them with Della's statute book, a notepad, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Nobody talked. Tommy read. The bridle leather stretched and accepted the needle. Wren's pen moved. The rain set its one note over and over on the roof, and the stove put out its even warmth. And the afternoon folded around the three of them without asking permission. At some point, Tommy turned a page and said, without looking up, The Missouri goes all the way to St. Louis and empties into the Mississippi there, Wren said, which goes further south from there. I didn't know rivers kept going after they hit other rivers. They don't stop. They just become part of something larger. He thought about this. Colt's needle went through leather. Does it still count as the Missouri after that? The name changes. The water doesn't. Tommy looked at the page again. Whatever he made of that, he made silently. He turned back to reading. Wren looked at her notepad. She looked at the window where rain ran down in long, irregular lines. She thought, I did not choose this room, but I am choosing to stay in it. There was a difference between those two things, that she was only beginning to understand the difference between what happens to a person and what a person decides to do inside what happens. It was not a large distance in terms of physical space. It was everything in terms of what it meant. She picked up her pen. She kept writing. 2 evenings later, Colt left before dawn and did not come back until nearly noon. He gave no explanation when he left. She heard the door, heard the horse, and lay still in the not quite dark, thinking about whether she had a right to ask, and deciding she did not. Not yet. Not because rights were not hers, but because she had not yet earned the specific knowledge of when asking was help and when it was intrusion. That was a fine distinction that took time. He came back with mud to his knees and his shirt dark at the shoulders. He went to the well, washed his hands and face. He came inside, and he put something on the table. A handful of wildflowers. The kind that grow by running water, small purple, the kind nobody ever picks, because they are not impressive enough to make the effort worthwhile. They were already beginning to wilt. Eleanor's grave, he said. I went. He said it the way he said all true things plainly, without asking for a response. Was it, she started, overgrown? I cleared it. He was already moving toward the stove, already reaching for the coffee pot. I didn't know what to say. Didn't say anything. He poured a cup, stood there long enough that it seemed like enough. She looked at the flowers on the table. They were completely ordinary. They were, she thought, the most specific thing he had ever given her. Not comfort, not gesture, but information. This is what I did with what you said, which was its own kind of response, and more honest than anything decorative. I think that probably was enough, she said. He drank his coffee, standing, looking out the window at the pasture. She went back to her work. The letter from the lawyer in Cheyenne arrived on a Thursday. She had written 3 weeks prior. A careful letter, precise, setting out the nature of the case she was building without making claims she could not yet support. She had not expected warmth. She had expected professional honesty, and that was what she received. The lawyer's name was Edmund Garfield. His letter was 2 pages and completely direct. The evidence, as described, is sufficient to initiate a formal inquiry, he wrote. It is not sufficient to guarantee a favorable outcome, and I would counsel you to understand this distinction clearly before proceeding. Silas Reed is a circuit judge with long-standing relationships in the county and substantial influence in the territorial court. Initiating action against a sitting judge on the basis of property fraud is not a case that resolves quickly or without personal cost to the petitioner. You may win the opening argument and lose the sustained one. The court system moves slowly, and slow courts favor men who have the resources to wait. That said, the documentation you describe, if it is what you believe it to be, constitutes a pattern of conduct that the territorial court cannot formally ignore, particularly with Wyoming statehood imminent and the federal review of territorial land practices currently underway. Timing in this instance may be your strongest asset. If you wish to proceed, I can be in Cheyenne for a preliminary review of documents in 3 weeks. I will charge only for time actually spent, as this is the kind of case I would have taken 20 years ago for no charge at all. And I am finding at my age that this distinction matters to me. She read the letter twice. Then she brought it to the table where Colt was eating breakfast. She read it aloud. When she finished, he was looking at his plate. She waited. "He's saying you might win the first round and lose the case," he said. "Yes. And you want to proceed anyway." She put the letter down. "I want to know if you do. It's your land." He looked up. "It's our land. You signed the deed." The word "our" arrived without ceremony. He had simply used it and moved on as if it were already established fact, rather than a thing being proposed. She absorbed it the way you absorb something that has been true for a while, and you are only now catching up to. If Eleanor had someone who could read law when Reed came for her land, she said she would not have lost it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not grief exactly, not anymore. Something older and stiller, like a wound that is closed but changed the landscape around it. "I know," he said quietly. "Then that's my answer." She picked up the letter and folded it. "And mine doesn't change based on the odds." He was quiet for a moment. Then, right back to Garfield. "Tell him 3 weeks." Tommy came the next day at the regular time, and he was not alone in the fact of what he carried. He sat down for his lesson and went through the arithmetic she set out for him with the focused speed of a boy whose mind moves faster than the problems require. And at the end, when she was correcting the last page, he said, without particular preamble, "My father knows about the Cheyenne lawyer." She looked up. He had a man at the postal office tell him about letters going out. Tommy kept his eyes on the table. "He's planning to file a motion with the county court to review the terms of your marriage contract. He says there's a procedural question about the timing of the registration." "There isn't," she said. "The registration was stamped and filed before any question of contest arose." "I know. I looked at the statute you marked in the book." He glanced at her sideways. "You left it on the table last week." She felt something that was not quite pride, and not quite surprise, more like recognition. Of course he looked. Of course he understood what he was looking at. Tommy. She put the papers down. "How did you come to know this?" He was quiet for a moment. "I heard him talking to his clerk. In the office. I wasn't." He stopped. Reconsidered. "I was in the hallway. I could hear." "And you came here?" "Yes." She looked at him. 13 years old, son of the man she was building a case against, sitting at her table having done something that would cost him something. When his father found out, which his father would. She did not thank him. She understood by now that he had not come for thanks, and that gratitude would make it feel transactional. and that what he had done was not transactional. He had simply acted according to what he had begun to understand about what was right. "Stay for supper," she said. He looked up, surprised. "You've been reading for 2 hours. You should eat before you walk back." She set a third plate on the table without further discussion. When Colt came in from the evening check and found the boy sitting at his table, he said nothing. He washed his hands. He sat down. They ate in the same kind of quiet the rain afternoon had produced. Companionable, undemanding three people who had found themselves in the same room through an accumulation of events none of them had originally planned. Before Tommy left, he placed the geography book on the table. He opened the front cover and turned it so she could see. On the inside cover, in careful block letters that he had made as precise as he knew. How was his name Thomas Reed, not Tommy? The full name, written by his own hand in a book she had lent him the way a person marks something as theirs. She looked at it. "Good," she said. He walked back to town in the early dark. Colt stood in the doorway watching him go, then turned back inside. He looked at the name in the front of the book for a moment before she closed it. "He's going to be all right," Colt said. It was not a question and not quite a statement. More like a thing he needed to say to be sure he believed it. "Yes," she said. "He is." She put the geography book on the shelf beside the statute and the ledgers and the letters and all the other gathered materials of the case they were building, patient line by line, in the language Silas Reed had not expected anyone in that cabin to speak. Outside, the last of the evening light was going off the hills. Inside, the lamp burned on. Edmund Garfield arrived in Harrow Creek on a Tuesday, driving his own buggy, which told Wren two things before he spoke a word. He was a man accustomed to going places under his own power, and he did not think the impression made by a hired rig was worth the cost. He was perhaps 65, spare in the way of men who have always eaten plainly, with the careful eyes of someone who has spent a lifetime listening to what people say when they think they are only talking. He shook Wren's hand first, then Colt's. He sat at the table and he opened his case, and he read every document she had assembled without comment for nearly 2 hours, pausing occasionally to make a mark in his own notebook, asking 3 questions the entire time, all of them precise, all of them about dates. When he finished, he closed his notebook. "This is sufficient," he said. "I want to be clear about what sufficient means. It means a formal inquiry can be compelled. It means a judge in Cheyenne who does not owe Silas Reed a favor will have to look at these records. It does not mean Reed loses his position. It does not mean every transaction gets reversed. Some of this happened legally, even if the conditions that produced it were not." "I understand," Wren said. "What it does mean," Garfield continued, "is that a pattern becomes visible. When a pattern becomes visible in a formal court record, it tends to make future repetitions substantially more difficult." He looked at her over his glasses. "You are not going to undo the past, Mrs. Breaker. You may be able to prevent the future." "That's what I came for," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man revising an estimate upward. "The filing will happen in Cheyenne. You'll need to be present. Reed will know within a day he has people in the territorial court." "I know. It will not be comfortable after that. It hasn't been comfortable before that." She folded her hands on the table. "Mr. Garfield, How many women have been in this arrangement in 3 years? He glanced at the ledgers. Based on what's here, 11, possibly more. And how many of those properties are still in the hands they started in? A pause. 4. She nodded. Then, let's go to Cheyenne. They left on Thursday before light. The documents rode with her in a leather case Della had lent for the purpose originals, not copies. Colt had asked once if she should leave copies at the cabin. She had said no. Original signatures, she told him, were the only kind that counted. The road to Cheyenne took 2 days by wagon, and Garfield drove with the patient efficiency of a man who understands that speed and endurance are different resources and chooses accordingly. Wren sat beside him for the first day, and they talked about the law about Wyoming statehood, about the particular difficulty of prosecuting institutional corruption in a place where the institution is small enough that everyone in it knows everyone else personally. Garfield had been practicing for 40 years. He had, he said, taken the case because the documentation was clean, and because he was old enough that his reputation could afford the risk of losing, and because there was a satisfaction in certain kinds of work that money did not entirely account for. "You prepared this yourself," he said at one point, not admiringly, simply noting a fact. "I had access to good source material," she said. "You had access to a statute book and some ledgers. Most people with the same materials would have produced something unusable." She thought about Connecticut, about a man in a mahogany office who had slid a document across a desk and watched with mild surprise when she read it, about a schoolroom where she had spent years teaching children that letters were tools, about the specific education of being a woman who has had to be twice as precise as the room requires in order to be taken at her own valuation. "I was well practiced," she said, and left it at that. Colt rode alongside for the first 4 hours, then turned back. The cattle needed tending, and the work of the land did not pause for legal proceedings. Before he turned his horse, he came alongside the wagon and looked at her for a moment. "Come back," he said. Just that. Not a request exactly. Not a command. The simple statement of what he wanted, spoken plainly in the way of a man who has finally stopped believing that plainness is a vulnerability. She held his gaze. "I'll be back by Sunday." He turned the horse. She watched him go until the road bent and he disappeared into the morning light. And then she turned back to face forward, and the wagon moved on. The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne was a building that took itself seriously. Stone facade, heavy doors. The particular institutional smell of government paper and old wood, and the accumulated weight of decisions made in rooms like this over decades. Wren walked in with Garfield beside her and the documents under her arm, and she felt the building register her, the way buildings like this register women as a slight anomaly, a thing present but not entirely expected. She had been in rooms like this before in smaller versions. She knew how to move through them. You did not walk as if you were apologizing for your presence. You did not walk as if you were demanding to be recognized. You walked as if you had business here, which was the simple truth, and you let the business speak. The clerk at the filing window was young, methodical, and professionally incurious. He took the documents, he stamped them, he looked at the date. He wrote something in his ledger. "Filed," he said. 7:43 in the morning. Garfield signed the receiving copy. Wren signed beneath him. She looked at her signature on the page. Wren Breaker. The name had acquired in the weeks since she had first put it on paper, a familiarity that was beginning to feel like ownership. Not the ownership of something taken from someone else, the ownership of something made. They were in the building for 40 minutes. Garfield took her to a restaurant afterward. Plain food, good coffee, and they sat across from each other, and he told her what would happen next in sequence and what each step required of her. And she listened and asked 3 questions, and took notes on 2 of them. At one point he paused and looked at her with the appraising patience of a man who has worked with many people over many years and has developed a reasonable sense of who will hold up under sustained pressure. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Based on the circumstances." "What did you expect? Someone harder, or someone more frightened?" "You're neither." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "I've been both. They weren't useful, so I put them down." He smiled briefly with the restraint of a man for whom smiling has always been a considered act. "Don't put them down entirely. Fear has its uses. So does hardness." "I know," she said. "I just stopped letting them drive." Reed knew by Friday morning. Wren was not there to see his face when he found out. She was still on the road back from Cheyenne, the wagon moving through the high country light of early autumn, when the information was traveling in the opposite direction, through the county's informal systems of men who owed each other things. She found out what she needed to know when she arrived home Sunday evening, and Colt told her without preamble that a man had come to the property on Saturday. Not Reed himself. One of the men who ran errands for him, a broad, deliberate man named Holcomb, who had the look of someone paid specifically for his willingness to be present in situations that had not yet become violent, but were being positioned that way. "He came while you were gone," Colt said. "What did he want?" "The original ledger. Della's ledger." Colt's voice was even. He said there had been a filing error, that certain records needed to be reviewed before they were submitted formally. "What did you say?" "I said the records weren't here." He paused. "Which is true. You had them. And then I told him he was on my land without an invitation, and that he should leave." She looked at him. That was all. That was all that was needed. She tried to read his face for what he was not saying. He let her. "He was larger than me," Colt said, "and he wanted me to know it. Men like that rely on the other person doing the calculation and deciding it doesn't add up in their favor." He looked at the window. "I've been in enough situations where the calculation didn't matter to know that it mostly doesn't matter." She understood then what had happened. Not a confrontation exactly. A moment of stillness, one man holding his ground in the specific way that communicates that the ground will not be moved, and another man doing the calculation Colt had described, and arriving at the conclusion that today was not the day. She felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, she had not been afraid for him exactly. Something more like the understanding that this man will not look away from the things he has decided to stand in front of. "Thank you," she said. He looked mildly uncomfortable with this which was so characteristic of him that she almost smiled. "I didn't do anything," he said. "You stood where you were supposed to stand," she said. "That's not nothing." The weeks that followed were the particular kind of difficult that has no clean edges. Reed did not move openly. Men like Reed never moved openly when they could move through intermediary pressure. A word here, a favor called in there. The slow application of social gravity that does not leave marks. Suppliers became unreliable. The man who had been coming to help with the fall roundup sent word that he was occupied. A family 2 miles north who had been friendly in the easy way of neighbors stopped being visible. Wren watched this happen and did not allow herself to be surprised by it. This was what Della had described the way Reed operated, the patient accumulation of small isolations that added up to a siege. She had expected it. Expecting it did not make it comfortable. It made it legible, which was the only thing she had actually needed. She kept working. In the mornings, she prepared documentation for Garfield responses to the court's procedural questions. Supplementary evidence, the careful architecture of a legal argument built one precise piece at a time. In the afternoons, she taught Tommy, who kept coming regardless of what his father's household was doing, arriving at the regular hour with his books, and the expression of a boy who has decided that some choices are not subject to renegotiation. She did not ask him what was happening at home. She understood that he was managing 2 worlds with the limited tools of a 13-year-old, and that the most useful thing she could do was keep one of those worlds steady. The week after the inquiry was ordered, Tommy did not come for 3 days. He returned on Thursday without explanation, sat down, and opened his book. She did not ask where he had been. She set out the arithmetic. Halfway through the lesson, without looking up from the page, he said, "My father called me into his office." She waited. "He knew I'd told you about the motion. He didn't ask how I knew to tell you, he just knew." Tommy turned his pencil over once. He said I'd chosen strangers over family. "What did you say?" I said I'd chosen what was right over what was convenient. He paused. I don't think that's what he expected me to say. She looked at him, 13 years old, sitting straight in his chair, having said a true thing to his father, and survived it. How did he respond? He sent me out of the room. Tommy was quiet for a moment. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was recalculating something. He turned back to his arithmetic. I don't know what. She thought she knew. A man who has built his life on the assumption that other people don't read carefully, don't look closely, don't push back. And his own son has just done all 3. She said nothing else about it. Neither did Tommy. They finished the lesson and she set out the next page, and he worked through it with the focused attention of a boy who has done something difficult and is now quietly on the other side of it. One afternoon, after the 3 days of absence, he worked through a page of arithmetic so quickly that she had nothing prepared for the next step, and they sat for a moment with nothing on the table between them. He said, without looking up, "My father isn't gonna win this, is he?" Not a question. A calculation being read aloud. She was careful with her answer. "I don't know how it ends," she said. "I know that what we filed is real and that real things have to be answered. He's angry." "I expect so." "He's not angry at you." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "He's angry that someone read the contracts." He turned the pencil over in his fingers. He always said that most people don't read past the part they want to see. He was right about that, Wren said. Most people don't. You did. Yes. He set the pencil down. "I'm going to," he said. "From now on, read the whole thing." She looked at him. "That's a good decision." He picked the pencil back up and went back to the arithmetic. The conversation was over. He had said what he needed to say and filed it and moved on with the practical economy of someone who is learning, maybe for the first time, that language can be a tool rather than a weapon. The hearing in Cheyenne happened on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the filing. Garfield had told her not to expect drama, and there was none. The territorial judge was a man named Hardcastle Dry, unhurried with the manner of someone who has read so many documents in his life that the particular weight of these ones did not from the outside appear different from any others. Reed was present. He sat across the room with two men Wren did not recognize, and he looked at her once when she came in, a long, calibrating look. The look of a man revising his assessment of a situation he thought he had controlled. He did not look away first. Neither did she. Garfield presented the documentation in the order they had prepared. The pattern of transactions, the timing of each, the language of the contracts set against the language of the statutes, the correspondence that established a system rather than a series of individual arrangements. Reed's counsel argued procedural objections, filing dates, jurisdiction, the limits of what constituted sufficient evidence for a formal inquiry as opposed to a formal charge. Hardcastle listened to all of it. He looked at the documents for a long time. Then he said that he was ordering a formal inquiry into the land transactions in question, to be overseen by the territorial court rather than the county court. Pending the inquiry, Silas Reed's authority to execute or represent in property transactions in Apache and Carbon counties was suspended. That was all. Not a conviction, not a judgment. A process initiated, overseen by someone outside Reed's orbit. Wren walked out of the courthouse into October light and stood on the stone steps and let the cold air come in. Garfield stood beside her. "That's what winning looks like in the first round," he said. "I know," she said. "You don't look disappointed." "I'm not." She looked out at the street, at the ordinary traffic of a city going about its business, indifferent to what had just happened in one room of one building. "I came here to make something visible. It's visible now." "Reed isn't finished," Garfield said. "He has resources and connections and a long memory." "So do I," she said. "Mine are different, but I have them." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided something he had been uncertain about. "Mrs. Breaker," he said, "if you're ever inclined to read law formally, and I mean formally, not just statute books, at a kitchen table, I know people in Cheyenne who would be interested in that conversation." She turned to look at him. That, she said after a moment, is the first piece of genuinely unexpected news I've received in some time. He almost smiled. "Think about it." She thought about it on the 2-day ride home. About what it meant. About whether it was the kind of thing a person did or the kind of thing a person only imagined. About the difference between those two categories and who decided which things belonged in which one. She had not yet resolved it when she came through the gate of the property on Sunday afternoon, and Colt was in the yard. He looked up when he heard the wagon. He set down what he was working on. He watched her drive in. She climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard that was, according to every legal document in the state of Wyoming, as much hers as his. "How did it go?" he said. "We got the inquiry ordered. Reed's authority is suspended pending review." He was quiet for a moment, processing, not with skepticism, with the care of a man who wants to understand what he is hearing correctly. "Is that enough?" She looked at the cabin. At the fence line, the well, the hills beyond going gold in the late light. For now, she said, it's enough for now. She found the letter that evening. She had known it was there. Had placed it herself under the corner of the statute book weeks ago. She had moved around it and past it and beside it every day since. And every day she had decided not today. Today she sat down at the table alone. Colt was in the barn, the evening stretching quiet around the house, and she moved the statute book and she picked it up. Her father's handwriting on the outside. Hartford, Connecticut return address. Dated 1885. She opened it. It was not what she had imagined, which was a letter from Reed to her father. It was a letter from her father to Reed the other direction. She had understood this when Della described it, but understanding it in the abstract and reading the words in his handwriting were different things in the way that knowing a river is cold and stepping into it are different things. He wrote in the formal, careful prose of a man who considers every word a reflection of his character. He wrote that he had given the matter significant, prayerful consideration. He wrote that he was prepared to serve as a point of referral for suitable candidates, women of his acquaintance or congregation, who might benefit from the opportunities available in the Wyoming Territory. He wrote that the arrangement Silas Reed had described seemed to him a legitimate path for women who found themselves without other resources. He wrote that he would appreciate the consideration of a modest referral arrangement. Below this, in Reed's hand, agreed. $15 per referral confirmed. Below that, her father's signature. And the date, 1885. 4 years ago, when Wren had been teaching in Hartford, and her father had been keeping his accounts and praying on Sundays and holding the door of the church with the expression of a man engaged in acts of daily grace. She sat with the letter for a long time. She was looking for something. She realized after a while that she was looking for a way to be wrong about what she was reading. The habit of daughters who have needed their fathers to be what they believe them to be. She had carried this habit so long she had not known it was a habit. She was not wrong about what she was reading. Her father had known, had participated, had received money for it, not a great sum, $15 less than a week's wages for a working man, but money paid into an account that accumulated quietly alongside the debts he was also accumulating. And neither pile had ever been mentioned to her. The advertisement in the drawer, the one she had found after his death, and believed he had kept out of some obscure kind of provision for her, some paternal instinct toward her security. He had kept it because he was in the business of it. She had been in some version of his accounting inventory. She looked at this for a long time. She looked at it the way you look at a thing you have been carrying without knowing you were carrying it, trying to understand both the weight you have just set down and the new shape your hands have now that they are empty. She had come to Wyoming because she had no other choice. She had come to Wyoming because her father's choices had made it so. She had come to Wyoming and she had built something. She had read a statute book and learned to string fence wire and taught a boy whose name she had watched him claim for himself. She had stood in a courthouse and made a pattern visible that powerful men had relied on staying invisible. She had signed her name, not her father's name attached to hers, but the name she had made to documents that would outlast this particular autumn by decades. None of that changed. What changed was the story she had been telling herself about where she came from. She had believed she came from a man of modest virtue and honest failing. That was a simpler story than the true one. The true one had more rooms in it, and some of them were dark, and she would have to learn to move through them without pretending they weren't there. She was not the first person to discover that the people who shaped you were also shaped by things you were not told about. She would not be the last. She held the letter over the tin bowl. She lit the match. She watched the paper catch reluctant, then all at once, and she held it until the bowl held nothing but gray. And then she set the bowl down on the porch step, and she went back inside. Colt was in from the barn. He looked at her face when she came in and said nothing, which was the correct response. He put the kettle on. He sat at the table. She sat across from him. The kettle built its sound slowly, and the lamp threw its steady light. And outside, the Wyoming dark settled into the hills, the way it always did, enormous, private, entire. It was from my father, she said, to read. He was part of it. Colt absorbed this. His face did not change in any dramatic way. He had a face that processed difficult information, quietly carrying it inward rather than displaying it, which could read as coldness to people who did not know better, and read as something else entirely to people who did. "Are you all right?" he said. She thought about the answer. "I will be. I'm in the part of it that isn't yet." He nodded. "I'm also," she paused. "I'm lighter. I know that sounds wrong. It doesn't. I've been carrying a version of him that wasn't accurate. A version I needed to be true." She looked at the table. Putting it down is a loss and a relief at the same time. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it tonight," Colt said. He poured the tea when the kettle was ready. He set a cup in front of her. He sat back down. They sat like that for a while, not filling the silence, just existing in it, which was the thing she had come to understand, was the specific gift of being with a person who did not require you to perform your own recovery for their comfort. After some time, she said, "Garfield offered me something. In Cheyenne." "What kind of something?" "He knows people who are looking to train women in formal legal practice. Not as lawyers, Wyoming doesn't have that yet, but as legal clerks with real authority. Document preparation, court filing. The kind of work I've been doing but formally recognized." Colt looked at his cup. "In Cheyenne," he said. He didn't specify. It might be correspondence work. It might require travel sometimes. She waited. "I haven't said yes. I haven't said no." He was quiet for long enough that she let him be quiet. She watched the lamp. She listened to the night outside. "You should do it," he said, "if it's what you want." "I don't know yet what I want. I know I'm good at it. Those aren't the same thing." "No," she said, "but they're related." He looked at her. In the lamplight, he looked for a moment younger than he was, or not younger, but more present. Less armored against whatever had required the armor for so many years. Something in him had been shifting since the morning he came back from Eleanor's grave with those small purple flowers. She had watched it happening incrementally, the way you watch a slow change in weather that is only obvious in retrospect. "Wren," he said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me true." "All right." "When the inquiry is done, when this is as finished as it's going to get, Do you want to stay here? She looked at him. She thought about the question. Really thought about it, gave it the weight it deserved. Resisted the first answer that came and waited for the true one. You're asking the wrong question, she said. He waited. Staying to make someone happy. That's one thing. Staying because it's mine, that's another. She put her hands flat on the table. This land is mine. On paper and in fact, which is the same thing now. These fields and this fence line and that well, and the juniper tree where I teach Tommy Reed his geography. She paused. Della owes me a book on commercial law. I have a case ongoing that will require my attention for another year at least. And your horse, my horse, Colt said, has started eating carrots from my hand, which took 4 months, and I'm not abandoning that progress. His mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, Colt. Breaker's smiles were not quite smiles always held slightly in reserve, as if he was not entirely certain smiling was something he had earned. But it was the closest he came, and she had learned to read it. I'm not staying for you, she said. I'm staying because this is where my name is. Does that answer your question? He looked at her for a long moment. Then, yes. Does it answer it the way you wanted? Better, he said. She carved the notch on a Saturday, not into a post, not into a wall, into the frame of the gate at the entrance to the property the gate Colt had built with joints so close the wind couldn't find them. She found a good piece of flint, and she made a single mark deep and clean in the wood below the latch, not to count anything, not to commemorate a victory, just to mark the place where she had passed through going one direction and intended to pass through going the other, for a long time to come. Colt watched her do it from the porch. He did not ask what it meant. He understood the language she was speaking, the language of a person claiming a thing, by leaving a mark on it which is as old as any language spoken anywhere. Tommy Reed came that afternoon and they sat under the juniper tree, and she taught him about the Missouri River drainage and the way water moves when it has found its course and will not be redirected without enormous cost. Like people, he said. Sometimes, she said, when they've found the right direction. He looked at her. Have you? She thought about the courthouse in Cheyenne, the tin bowl with the ash in it, the statute book on the shelf, the gate with the new mark in the wood, the horse that had finally begun to take carrot from her hand. Yes, she said. I think so. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to the river and its tributaries, which were many, and which each had their own names. That evening, Wren and Colt sat on the porch as the last of the light left the hills. She had a letter to write to Garfield. She had decided in the way that real decisions arrive, not with drama, but with the quiet settling of something that has been in motion for a while. She would write to say yes, she was interested in the work she would need, to understand the specifics. She had obligations here that were not negotiable. She would see what could be arranged. Tomorrow she would plant the last of the fall garden. It was late in the season for it. But some things grew in cold ground better than warm, and she had learned to trust the particular knowledge of a place rather than the general knowledge she had brought with her from somewhere else. The stars came out one at a time, the way they always did up here, tentative at first, then committed, then in their full, overwhelming number, the kind of sky that makes the concerns of a single human life seem briefly small, and then on reflection more significant because this vast, indifferent beauty is the context in which a single human life unfolds, which means every one of them is happening against this backdrop, which means every one of them carries more weight than it might otherwise appear. Colt began to name them. The dog that runs ahead, the woman who wouldn't come back down, the elk in the deep winter. She listened. After a while, she began to repeat them back to him. Not to prove she had been listening, to fix them in herself the way you fix a new language, by speaking it aloud and hearing your own voice give it shape. He corrected her once gently on a cluster near the horizon. She repeated it correctly. He said nothing, but she felt him shift slightly on the step beside her, settle in the way a person settles when they have arrived somewhere they intended to be. Somewhere in the county, Silas Reed was sitting with whatever a man sits with, when the ground he thought he owned has begun to move beneath him. Somewhere in town, Tommy Reed was probably reading by lamplight, or trying to sleep, or lying awake thinking about rivers and the places they go when you follow them long enough. Somewhere in her past, a man she had called her father was the sum of everything he had been. Not all of it good, not all of it known to her until now, but all of it hers to understand or not understand, to carry or to set down as she decided. She had burned what she needed to burn. She had planted what she intended to grow. She had signed her name to enough things now that the name felt inhabited, not borrowed, not inherited, not assigned by a contract or a courtroom, or a man who thought she was an instrument. Signed by her own hand on her own terms in a state that had decided before almost anywhere else that a woman's name on a document carried exactly the same weight as anyone else's. Wyoming had not done that for her benefit. Wyoming had done it for its own complicated reasons, and she had used it, which was different and which was enough. The stars continued their long work. She was not going back to Connecticut. She was not going back to the woman who had walked home through Hartford streets with her father's debt and her own good sense and not much else. That woman had made necessary choices in difficult conditions, and she had done her work, and she had brought Wren Calloway to the gate of a property in Wyoming, and that was where her jurisdiction ended. The woman on this porch, in this dark under these named and nameable stars, was someone else. Someone made from the same material, but by different hands. Her own hands mostly over the past months, in the particular workshop of a life she had not chosen, and had then chosen to inhabit as completely as she knew how. Wren Breaker. She tried the name silently, the way you try a word you've been learning. It fit. It fit the way things fit when they have been worked into shape rather than found that way. Not perfectly, not without effort, not without the marks of the making visible to anyone who looked closely enough, but solid, real. The kind of thing that if you pushed against it, pushed back, she would keep it. The night moved around them. Colt was quiet beside her, which was his natural state and no longer felt like absence. It had taken her a while to learn that some silences are full rather than empty, and that the fullness is only audible once you stop listening for noise. She listened to it now. It sounded like staying. It sounded like the beginning of something she did not yet have a word for, which was fine. She had learned to read. She could learn the word when she found it. For now, this, the dark, the stars, the man who named them, the land with her name on it, the work still ahead, the letter she would write tomorrow, the gate with her mark in the wood. The garden not yet planted, the case not yet finished, the future not yet anything but possible. This was enough, more than enough. It was hers.